Hello, Squirrel Squad listeners! We are on chapter 12 called An Explanation and a Dare in our Anne of Green Gables, Avonlea, whatever series, Rainbow Valley. So chapter 12. The Reverend Dr. Cooper preached in Glen St. Mary the next evening, and the Presbyterian church was crowded with people from near and far. And I got my water bottle too. Yay. It's a little closer. The Reverend Doctor was reputed to be a very eloquent speaker, and bearing in mind the old dictum that a minister should take his best clothes to the city and his best sermons to the country, he delivered a very scholarly and impressive discourse. But when the folks went home that night, it was not of Dr. Cooper's sermon they talked. They had completely forgotten all about it. Dr. Cooper had concluded with a fervent appeal, had wiped the perspiration from his massive brow, had said, "Let us pray," as he was famed for saying it, and had duly prayed. There was a slight pause. In Glen St. Mary Church, the old fashion of taking the collection after the sermon instead of before still held, mainly because the Methodists had adopted the fashion first, and Miss Cornelia and Elder Clow would not hear of following where Methodists had led. Charles Baxter and Thomas Douglas, whose duty it was to pass the plates, were on the point of rising to their feet. The organist had got out the music of her anthem, and the choir had cleared its throat. Suddenly, Faith Meredith rose in the manse pew, walked up to the pulpit platform, and faced the amazing audience. Miss Cornelia half rose in her seat and then sat down again. Her pew was far back, and it occurred to her that whatever Faith meant to do or say would be half done or said before she could reach her. There was no use making the exhibition worse than it had to be. With an anguished glance at Mrs. Dr. Blythe and another at Deacon Warren of the Methodist Church, Miss Cornelia resigned herself to another scandal. "If the child was only dressed decently itself," she groaned in spirit. Faith, having spilled ink on her good dress, had serenely put on an old one of faded pink print. A catty-cornered rent in the skirt had been darned with scarlet tracing cotton, and the hem had been let down, showing a bright strip of unfaded pink around the skirt. But Faith was not thinking of her clothes at all. She was feeling suddenly nervous. What had seemed easy in imagination was rather hard in reality. Confronted by all those staring, questioning eyes, Faith's courage almost failed her. She's going to explain about Sunday, I bet. The lights were so bright, the silence so awesome, she thought she must speak. She could not speak after all, but she must. Her father must be cleared of suspicion, only the words would not come. Una's little pearl-pure face gleamed up at her beseechingly from the manse pew. The Blythe children were lost in amazement. Back under the gallery, Faith saw the sweet graciousness of Miss Rosemary West's smile and the amusement of Miss Ellen's. But none of these helped her. It was Bertie Shakespeare Drew who saved the situation. Bertie Shakespeare sat in the front seat of the gallery, and he made a derisive face at Faith. Faith promptly made a dreadful one back at him, and in her anger over being grimaced at by Bertie Shakespeare, forgot her stage fright. She found her voice and spoke out clearly and bravely. "I want to explain something," she said, "and I want to do it now because everybody will hear it that heard the other. People are saying that Una and I stayed home last Sunday and cleaned house instead of going to Sunday school. Well, we did, but we didn't mean to. We got mixed up in the days of the week. It was all Elder Baxter's fault," sensation in Baxter's pew, "because he went and changed the prayer meeting to Wednesday night And then we thought Thursday was Friday, and so on till we thought Saturday was Sunday. Carl was laid up sick, and so was Aunt Martha, so they couldn't put us right. We went to Sunday school in all that rain on Saturday, and nobody came. And then we thought we'd clean house on Monday and stop old cats from talking about how dirty the manse was. General sensation all over the church. And we did. I shook the rugs in the Methodist graveyard because it was such a convenient place, and not because I meant to be disrespectful of the dead. It isn't the dead folks who have made the fuss over this, it's the living folks. And it isn't right for any of you to blame my father for this because he was away and didn't know. And anyhow, we thought it was Monday. He's just the best father that ever lived in the world, and we love him with all our hearts. Faith's bravado ebbed out in a sob. She ran down the steps and flashed out of the side door of the church. There the friendly starlit summer night comforted her, and the ache went out of her eyes and throat. She felt very happy. The dreadful explanation was over, and everybody knew now that her father wasn't to blame, and that she and Una were not so wicked as to have cleaned house knowingly on Sunday. Inside, the church people gazed blankly at each other, but Thomas Douglas rose and walked up the aisle with a set face. His duty was clear. The collection must be taken if the skies fell. Taken it was. The choir sang the anthem with the dismal conviction that it fell terribly flat, and Dr. Cooper gave out the concluding hymn and pronounced the benediction with considerably less unction than usual. The Reverend Doctor had a sense of humor, and Faith's performance tickled him. Besides, John Meredith was well known in Presbyterian circles. Mr. Meredith returned home the next afternoon, but before his coming, Faith contrived to scandalize Glen St. Mary again. In the reaction from Sunday evening's intensity and strain, she was especially full of what Miss Cornelia would have called devilment on Monday. This led her to dare Walter Blythe to ride through Main Street on a pig while she rode another one. The pigs in question were two tall, lank animals, supposed to belong to Bertie Shakespeare Drew's father, which had been haunting the roadside by the manse for a couple of weeks. Walter did not want to ride a pig through Glen St. Mary, but whatever Faith Meredith dared him to do must be done. They tore down the hill and through the village. Faith bent double with laughter over her terrified courser. Walter, crimson with shame, they tore past the minister himself, just coming home from the station. He, being a little less dreamy and abstracted than usual, owing to having had a talk on the train with Miss Cornelia, who always wakened him up temporarily, noticed them, and thought he really must speak to Faith about it and tell her that such conduct was not seemly. But he had forgotten the trifling incident by the time he reached home. They passed Mrs. Alec Davis, who shrieked in horror, and they passed Miss Rosemary West, who laughed and sighed. Finally, just before the pigs swooped into Bertie Shakespeare Drew's backyard, never to emerge therefrom again, so great had been the shock to their nerves, Faith and Walter jumped off as Dr. and Mrs. Blythe drove swiftly by. "So that is how you bring up your boys," said Gilbert with mock severity. "Perhaps I do spoil them a little," said Anne contritely, "but oh, Gilbert, when I think of my childhood before I came to Green Gables, I haven't the heart to be very strict. How hungry for love and fun I was, an unloved little drudge with never a chance to play. They do have such good times with the manse children." "What about the poor pigs?" asked Gilbert. Anne tried to look sober and failed. "Do you really think it hurt them?" she said. "I don't think anything could hurt those animals. They've been the plague of the neighborhood this summer, and the Drews won't shut them up. But I'll talk to Walter, if I can keep from laughing when I do it." Miss Cornelia came up to Ingleside that evening to relieve her feelings over Sunday night. To her surprise, she found that Anne did not view Faith's performance in quite the same light as she did. "I thought there was something brave and pathetic in her getting up there before that church full of people to confess," she said. "You could see she was frightened to death, yet she was bound to clear her father. I loved her for it." "Oh, of course the poor child meant well," sighed Miss Cornelia, "but just the same it was a terrible thing to do, and is making more talk than the house cleaning on Sunday. That had begun to die away, and this has started it all up again. Rosemary West is like you. She said last night as she left the church that it was a plucky thing for Faith to do, but it made her feel sorry for the child too. Miss Ellen thought it all a good joke and said she hadn't had as much fun in church for years. Of course they don't care. They're Episcopalians, but we Presbyterians feel it. And there were so many hotel people there that night, and scores of Methodists. Mrs. Leander Crawford cried, she felt so bad, and Mrs. Alec Davis said the little hussy ought to be spanked. Miss Leander Crawford is always crying in church, said Susan contemptuously. She cries over every affecting thing the minister says. But you do not often see her name on a subscription list, Mrs. Dr. Dear. Tears come cheaper. She tried to talk to me one day about Aunt Martha being such a dirty housekeeper, and I wanted to say, everyone knows that you have been seen mixing up cakes in the kitchen washpan, Miss Leander Crawford, but I didn't say it. Mrs. Dr. Dear, because I have too much respect for myself to condescend to argue with the likes of her, but I could tell worse things than that of Mrs. Leander Crawford if I was disposed to gossip. And as for Mrs. Alec Davis, if she had said to me, Mrs. Dr. Dear, do you know what, if she had said that to me, Mrs. Dr. Dear, you know what I would have said? I would have said, I have no doubt you would like to spank Faith, Mrs. Davis, but you will never have the chance to spank a minister's daughter, either in this world or in that which is to come. If poor Faith had only been decently dressed, lamented Miss Cornelia again, it wouldn't have been quite that bad, but that dress looked dreadful as she stood there upon the platform. It was clean, though, Mrs. Dr. Dear, said Susan. They are clean children. They may be very heedless and reckless, Mrs. Dr. Dear, and I'm not saying they're not, but they never forget to wash behind their ears. With the whistle. This cartridge is raspberry lemonade, and it's so good. The idea of Faith forgetting what day was Sunday, persisted Miss Cornelia. She will grow up just as careless and impractical as her father, believe me. I suppose Carl would have known better if he hadn't been sick. I don't know what was wrong with him, but I think it very likely he'd been eating those blueberries that grew in the graveyard. No wonder they made him sick. If I was a Methodist, I'd try to keep my graveyard cleaned up at least. I am of the opinion that Carl only ate the sours that grew on the dike, said Susan hopefully. I do not think any minister's son would eat blueberries that grew on graves of dead people. You know it would not be so bad, Mrs. Dr. Dear, to eat things that grew on the dike. The worst of last night's performance was the face Faith made at somebody in the congregation before she started in, said Miss Cornelia. Elder Cloud declares she made it at him, and did you hear that she was seen riding a pig today? I saw her. Walter was with her. I gave him a very little scolding about it. He didn't say much, but he gave me the impression that it had been his idea and that Faith was not to blame. I do not believe that, Mrs. Dr. Dear, cried Susan up in arms. That is just Walter's way, to take the blame on himself. But you know as well as I do, Mrs. Dr. Dear, that blessed child would never have thought of riding on a pig even if he does write poetry. Oh, there's no doubt the notion was hatched in Faith Meredith's brain, said Miss Cornelia, and I don't dare say that I'm sorry that Amos Drew's old pigs did get their comeuppance for once, but the minister's daughter and the doctor's son, said Anne, mimicking Miss Cornelia's tone. Then she laughed. Dear Miss Cornelia, they're only little children, and you know they've never yet done anything bad. They're just heedless and impulsive, as I was myself once. They'll grow sedate and sober, as I've done. Miss Cornelia laughed too. There are times, Ann dearie, when I know by your eyes that your soberness is put on like a garment, and you're really aching to do something wild and young again. Well, I feel encouraged. Somehow a talk with you always does have that effect on me. Now, when I go to see Barbara Sampson, it's just the opposite. She makes me feel that everything's wrong and always will be. But, of course, living all your life with a man like Joe Sampson wouldn't be exactly cheering. It's a very strange thing to think that she married Joe Sampson after all her chances, remarked Susan. She was much sought after when she was a girl. She used to boast to me that she had 21 beaux and Mr. Pethick. What was Mr. Pethick? Well, he was sort of a hanger-on, Mrs. Dr. dear, but you could not exactly call him a beau. Laugh. Wait a minute. Call him a beau. I skipped a page. He did not really have any intentions, 21 beaux, and me that never had one. But Barbara went through the woods and picked up the crooked stick after all. And yet they say her husband can make better baking powder biscuits than she can. And she always gets him to make them when company comes to tea. Which reminds me that I have company coming to tea tomorrow, and I must go home and set my bread, said Miss Cornelia. Mary said she could set it, and no doubt she could, but while I live and move and have my being, I set my own bread, believe me. How is Mary getting on? Asked Anne. I've no fault to find with Mary, said Miss Cornelia rather gloomily. She's getting some flesh on her bones, and she's clean and respectful, though there's more in her than I can fathom. She's a sly puss. If you dug for 1,000 years, you could never get to the bottom of that child's mind, believe me. As for work, I never saw anything like her. She eats it up. Mrs. Wiley may have been cruel to her, but folks needn't say she made Mary work. Mary's a born worker. Sometimes I wonder which will wear out first, her legs or her tongue. I don't have enough to do to keep me out of mischief these days. I'll be real glad when school opens. I'll skip another page. No. Sorry, I ate peanuts. I still have little remnants. I'll be real glad when school opens, for then I'll have something to do again. Mary doesn't want to go to school, but I put my foot down and said that go she must. I shall not have the Methodist saying that I kept her out of school while I lolled in idleness. Let me see how long the next one is. We may read another one yet. Let's see. Yeah, let's go ahead and try to read 13. Okay, chapter 13 is called The House on the Hill. There was a little unfailing spring, always icy cold and crystal pure, in a certain birch-screened hollow of Rainbow Valley in the lower corner near the marsh. Not a great many people knew of its existence. The Mance and Ingleside children knew, of course, as they knew everything else about the Magic Valley. Occasionally they went there to get a drink, and it figured in many of their plays as a fountain of old romance. Anne knew of it and loved it because it somehow reminded her of the beloved Dryad's Bubble at Green Gables. Rosemary West knew of it. It was her fountain of romance, too. 18 years ago, she had sat behind it one spring twilight and heard young Martin Crawford stammer out a confession of fervent boyish love. She had whispered her own secret in return, and they had kissed and promised by the wildwood spring. They had never stood together by it again. Martin had sailed on his fatal voyage soon after, but to Rosemary West it was always a sacred spot, hallowed by that immortal hour of youth and love. Whenever she passed near it, she turned aside to hold a secret tryst with an old dream, a dream from which the pain had long gone, leaving only its unforgettable sweetness. The spring was a hidden thing. You might have passed it within 10 feet of it and never have suspected its existence. 2 generations past, a huge old pine had fallen almost across it. Nothing was left of the tree but its crumbling trunk, out of which the ferns grew thickly, making a green roof and lacy screen for the water. A maple tree grew beside it with a curiously gnarled and twisted trunk, creeping along the ground for a little way before shooting up into the air, and so forming a quaint seat. In September had flung a scarf of pale smoke blue asters around the hollow. John Meredith, taking the Crosslots Road through Rainbow Valley on his way home from some pastoral visits, around the harbor head one evening, turned aside to drink of the little spring. Walter Blythe had shown it to him one afternoon only a few days before, and they had a long talk together on the maple seat. John Meredith, under all his shyness and aloofness, had the heart of a boy. He had been called Jack in his youth, though nobody in Glen St. Mary would ever have believed it. Walter and he had taken to each other and talked unreservedly. Mr. Meredith found his way into some sealed and sacred chambers of the lad's soul wherein not even Di had ever looked. They were to be chums from that friendly hour, and Walter knew that he would never be frightened of the minister again. I never believed before that it was possible to get really acquainted with the minister, he told his mother that night. John Meredith drank from his slender white hand, whose grip of steel always surprised people who were unacquainted with it, and then sat down on the maple seat. He was in no hurry to go home. This was a beautiful spot, and he was mentally weary after a round of rather uninspiring conversations with many good and stupid people. The moon was rising, Rainbow Valley was wind-haunted, and stars sentineled only where he was, but afar from the upper end came the gay notes of children's laughter and voices. The ethereal beauty of the asters in the moonlight, the glimmer of the little spring, the soft croon of the brook, the wavering grace of the brackens all wove a white magic round John Meredith. He forgot congregational worries and spiritual problems. The years slipped away from him. He was a young divinity student again, and the roses of June were blooming red and fragrant on the dark queenly head of his Cecilia. He sat there and dreamed like any boy, and it was at this propitious moment that Rosemary West stepped aside from the bypath and stood beside him in that dangerous spell-weaving place. John Meredith stood up as she came in and really saw her for the first time. He had met her in his church once or twice and shaken hands with her abstractly, as he did with anyone he happened to encounter on his way down the aisle. He had never met her elsewhere, for the West were Episcopalians with church affinities in Lowbridge, and no occasion for calling upon them had ever arisen. Before tonight, if anyone had asked John Meredith what Rosemary West looked like, he would not have had the slightest notion. But he was never to forget her as she appeared to him in the glamour of kind moonlight by the spring. She was certainly not in the least like Cecilia, who had always been his ideal of womanly beauty. Cecilia had been small and dark and vivacious. Rosemary West was tall and fair and placid, yet John Meredith thought he had never seen so beautiful a woman. She was bareheaded, and her golden hair of a warm gold, molasses taffy color, as Di Blythe had said, was pinned in sleek close coils over her head. She had large, tranquil blue eyes that always seemed full of friendliness, a high white forehead, and a finely shaped face. Rosemary West was always called a sweet woman. She was so sweet that even her high-bred, stately air had never gained for her the reputation of being stuck up, which it would inevitably have done in the case of anyone else in Glen St. Mary. Life had taught her to be brave, to be patient, to love, to forgive. She had watched the ship on which her lover went sailing out of Four Winds Harbor into the sunset, but though she watched long, she had never seen it coming sailing back. That vigil had taken girlhood from her eyes, yet she kept her youth to a marvelous degree. Perhaps this was because she always seemed to preserve that attitude of delighted surprise towards life, which most of us... Sorry about that. I had that. But I had the sound turned off. I did have it turned off. Oh well. That means Kelly's on. Kelly's Crochet Adventures. I'll get to her. Coming back to her. Perhaps this was because she always seemed to preserve that attitude of delighted surprise towards life, which most of us leave behind in childhood, an attitude which not only made Rosemary herself seem young, but flung a pleasing illusion of youth over the consciousness of everyone who talked to her. John Meredith was startled by her loveliness, and Rosemary was startled by his presence. She had never thought she would find anyone by that remote spring, least of all the recluse of Glen St. Mary Manse. She almost dropped the heavy armful of books she was carrying home from the Glen Lending Library. And then, to cover her confusion, she told one of those small fibs which even the best of women do tell at times. I came for a drink," she said, stammering a little in answer to Mr. Meredith's grave, "Good evening, Miss West." She felt that she was an unpardonable goose, and she longed to shake herself. But John Meredith was not a vain man, and he knew she would likely have been as much startled had she met old Elder Clow in that unexpected fashion. Her confusion put him at ease, and he forgot to be shy. Besides, even the shyest of men can sometimes be quite audacious in moonlight. "Let me give you a cup," he said, smiling. There was a cup nearby. If he had only known it, a cracked, handleless blue cup secreted under the secreted under the maple by the Rainbow Valley children, but he didn't know it. So he stepped out to one of the birch trees and stripped a bit of its white skin away. Deftly he fashioned this into a three-cornered cup, filled it from the spring, and handed it to Rosemary. Rosemary took it and drank every drop to punish herself for her fib, for she was not in the least thirsty, and to drink a fairly large cupful of water when you're not thirsty is somewhat of an ordeal. Yet the memory of that draught was to be very pleasant to Rosemary. In after years it seemed to her that there was something sacramental about it. Perhaps this was because of what the minister did when she handed him back the cup. He stooped again and filled it and drank of it himself. It was only by accident that he put his lips just where Rosemary had put hers. and Rosemary knew it. Nevertheless, it had a curious significance for her. The two had drunk from the same cup. She remembered idly that an old aunt of hers used to say that when two people did this, their afterlives would be linked in some fashion, whether for good or ill. John Meredith held the cup uncertainly. He did not know what to do with it. The logical thing would have been to toss it away, but somehow he was disinclined to do this. Rosemary held out her hand for it. "Will you let me have it?" she said. "You made it so knackily. I never saw anyone make a birch cup so since my little brother used to make them long ago before he died. I learned how to make them when I was a boy camping out one summer. An old hunter taught me," said Mr. Meredith. "Let me carry your books, Miss West." Rosemary was startled into another fib and said, "Oh, they were not heavy," but the minister took them from her with quite a masterful air, and they walked away together. It was the first time Rosemary had stood by the valley spring without thinking of Martin Crawford. The mystic tryst had been broken. The little bypath wound around the marsh and then struck up the long wooded hill on top of which Rosemary lived. Beyond, through the trees, they could see the moonlight shining across the level summer fields, but the little path was shadowy and narrow. Trees crowded over it, and trees are never quite as friendly to human beings after nightfall as they are in daylight. They wrap themselves away from us. They whisper and plot furtively. If they reach out a hand to us, it has a hostile, tentative touch. People walking amid trees after night always draw closer together instinctively and involuntarily, making an alliance, a physical and mental, against certain alien powers around them. Rosemary's dress brushed against John Meredith as they walked. Not even an absent-minded minister, who was, after all, a young man still, though he firmly believed he had outlived romance, could be insensible to the charm of the night and the path and the companion. It's never quite safe to think we have done with life. When we imagine we have finished our story, fate has a trick of turning the page and showing us yet another chapter. These two people each thought their hearts belonged irrevocably to the past, but they both found their walk up that hill very pleasant. Rosemary thought the Glen minister was by no means as shy and tongue-tied as he had been represented. He seemed to find no difficulty in talking easily and freely. Glen housewives would have been amazed had they heard him, but then so many Glen housewives talked only gossip and the price of eggs, and John Meredith was not interested in either. He talked to Rosemary of books and music and wide world doings and something of his own history, and found that she could understand and respond. Rosemary, it appeared, possessed a book which Mr. Meredith had not read and wished to read. She offered to lend it to him, and when they reached the old homestead on the hill, he went in to get it. The house itself was an old-fashioned gray one, hung with vines, through which the light in the sitting room winked in friendly fashion. It looked down the glen over the harbor, silvered in the moonlight, to the sand dunes and the moaning ocean. They walked in through a garden that always seemed to smell of roses, even when no roses were in bloom. There was a sisterhood of lilies at the gate, and a ribbon of asters on either side of the broad walk, and a lacery of fir trees on the hill's edge beyond the house. "You have the whole world at your doorstep here," said John Meredith with a long breath. "What a view! What an outlook! At times I feel stifled down there in the glen. You can breathe up here." "It's calm tonight," said Rosemary, laughing. "If there were a wind, it would blow your breath away. We get at the airs. We get of the airts the wind can blow up here. This place should be called Four Winds instead of the harbor." "I like wind," he said. "A day when there is no wind seems to me dead. A windy day wakes me up." He gave a conscious laugh. "On a calm day I fall into daydreams. No doubt you know my reputation, Miss West. If I cut you dead the next time we meet, don't put it down to bad manners. Please understand that it's only abstraction, and forgive me and speak to me." They found Ellen West in the sitting room when they went in. She laid her glasses down on the book she had been reading and looked at them in amazement, tinctured with something else, but she shook hands amiably with Mr. Meredith, and he sat down and talked to her while Rosemary hunted out his book. Ellen West was 10 years older than Rosemary and so different from her that it was hard to believe they were sisters. She was dark and massive, with black hair, thick black eyebrows, and eyes of the clear slaty blue of the Gulf water in a north wind. She had a rather stern, forbidding look, but she was in reality very jolly, with a hearty gurgling laugh and a deep, mellow, pleasant voice with a suggestion of masculinity about it. She had once remarked to Rosemary that she would really like to have a talk with that Presbyterian minister at the Glen, to see if he could find a word to say to a woman when he was cornered. She had her chance now, and she tackled him on world politics. Miss Ellen, who was a great reader, had been devouring a book on the Kaiser of Germany, and she demanded Mr. Meredith's opinion of him. "A dangerous man," was his answer. "I believe you," Miss Ellen nodded. "Mark my words, Mr. Meredith, that man is going to fight somebody yet. He's aching to. He's going to set the world on fire." "If you mean that he will wantonly precipitate a great war, I hardly think so," said Mr. Meredith. "The day has gone by for that sort of thing." "Bless you, it hasn't," rumbled Ellen. "The day never goes by for men and nations to make asses of themselves and to take to the fist. The millennium isn't that near, Mr. Meredith, and you don't think it any more than I do. As for this Kaiser, mark my words, he's going to make a heap of trouble." And Miss Ellen prodded her book emphatically with her long finger. "Yes, if he isn't nipped in the bud, he's going to make trouble. We'll live to see it. You and I will live to see it, Mr. Meredith. And who is going to nip him?" "England should, but she won't." "Who is going to nip him? Tell me that, Mr. Meredith." Mr. Meredith couldn't tell her, but they plunged into a discussion of German militarism that lasted long after Rosemary had found the book. Rosemary said nothing, but sat in a little rocker behind Ellen and stroked an important black cat meditatively. John Meredith hunted big game in Europe with Ellen, but he looked oftener at Rosemary than at Ellen, and Ellen noticed it. After Rosemary had gone to the door with him and come back, Ellen rose and looked at her accusingly. "Rosemary West, that man has a notion of courting you." Rosemary quivered. Ellen's speech was like a blow to her. It rubbed all the bloom off the pleasant evening, but she would not let Ellen see how it hurt her. "Nonsense," she said, and laughed a little too carelessly. "You see a beau for me in every bush, Ellen. Why, he told me all about his wife tonight, how much she was to him, how empty her death had left the world." "Well, that may be his way of courting," retorted Ellen. "Men have all kinds of ways, I understand. But don't forget your promise, Rosemary. There's no need of my either forgetting or remembering it, said Rosemary a little wearily. You forget I'm an old maid, Ellen. It's only your sisterly delusion that I'm still young and blooming and dangerous. Mr. Meredith merely wants to be a friend. If he wants that much itself, he'll forget us both long before he gets back to the manse. I've no objection to your being friends with him, conceded Ellen, but it mustn't go beyond friendship, remember. I'm always suspicious of widowers. They're not given to romantic ideas about friendship. They're apt to mean business. As for this Presbyterian man, what do they call him shy for? He's not a bit shy, though he may be absent-minded, so absent-minded that he forgot to say a good night to me when you started to go to the door with him. He's got brains, too. There's so few men round that can talk sense to a body. I've enjoyed the evening. I wouldn't mind seeing more of him. But no philandering, Rosemary, mind you, no philandering. Rosemary was quite used to being warned by Ellen from philandering if she so much as talked 5 minutes to any marriageable man under 80 or over 18. She had always laughed at the warning with unfeigned amusement. This time it did not amuse her, it irritated her a little. Who wanted to philander? Don't be such a goose, Ellen, she said with unaccustomed shortness as she took her lamp. She went upstairs without saying good night. Ellen shook her head dubiously and looked at the black cat. What is she so cross about, St. George? She asked. When you howl, you're hit, I've always heard, George, but she promised, Saint. She promised. And we West always keep our words, so it won't matter if he does want to philander, George. She promised. I won't worry. Upstairs in her room, Rosemary sat down for a long while, looking out of the window across the moonlit garden to the distant, shining harbor. She felt vaguely upset and unsettled. She was suddenly tired of outworn dreams. And in the garden of the petals of the last red rose, make sure were scattered by a sudden little wind. Summer was over. It was autumn. And that's all of chapter 13. So we read 12 and 13 today. Yay! Next chapter is called Mrs. Alec Davis Makes a Call. I'll be on live at 5 today. Hope to see you there. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. Bye-bye.